The Old Testament reading for today is from Leviticus chapter 19. When you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap your field right up to its edge, neither shall you gather the gleanings after your harvest. And you shall not strip your vineyard bare, neither shall you gather the fallen grapes of your vineyard. You shall leave them for the poor and for the sojourner. I am the Lord your God. You shall not steal, you shall not deal falsely, you shall not lie to one another. You shall not swear by my name falsely, and so profane the name of your God. I am the Lord. You shall not oppress your neighbor or rob him. The wages of a hired worker shall not remain with you all night until the morning. You shall not curse the deaf or put a stumbling block before the blind, but you shall fear your God. I am the Lord. You shall do no injustice in court. You shall not be partial to the poor or defer to the great. But in righteousness you shall judge your neighbor. You shall not go around as a slanderer among your people, and you shall not stand up against the life of your neighbor. I am the Lord. You shall not hate your brother in your heart, but you shall reason frankly with your neighbor, lest you incur sin because of him. You shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against the sons of your people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. And the New Testament reading is from Luke chapter 10. And behold, a lawyer stood up to put him to the test, saying, Teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life? And he said to him, What is written in the law? How do you read it? And he answered, You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. And he said to him, You have answered correctly. Go, do this, and you will live. But he, desiring to justify himself, said to Jesus, And who is my neighbor? Jesus replied, A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he fell among robbers, who stripped him and beat him and departed, leaving him half dead. Now by chance a priest was going down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. So likewise a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he journeyed, came to where he was, and when he saw him, he had compassion. He went to him and bound up his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he set him on his own animal and brought him to an inn and took care of him. And the next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper, saying, Take care of him, and whatever more you spend, I will repay you when I come back. Which of these 3 do you think proved to be a neighbor to the man who fell among the robbers? He said, The one who showed him mercy. And Jesus said to him, You go and do likewise. This is the word of the Lord.
Good morning. Can you guys hear me? Nice. Good morning. My name is also John. I realize I'm the 3rd John to come up here, so it should be easy to remember our names. You can just guess John, and you're probably right. Anyway, good morning. It's great to be with you. Great to have the opportunity to share the Word of God with you. Today we're going to be looking at a very famous parable, the parable of the Good Samaritan. But before we get into it, I want to talk about 2 foods. The first is the durian. I don't know if you have had a durian before. The Bebouts have. But I have never actually had one. What I generally hear, though, about durians is that the first time you go to eat it, it's a rough experience. It apparently smells like gym socks or sweat or something like that. And so when you first go to eat it, it's not great. But apparently as you come back, 3rd, 4th time trying it, you start to really appreciate the kind of depth of flavor, and you kind of start to acquire a taste for it. And so you start to love it more over time. On the other hand, you have grocery store sugar cookies, which are the opposite. You're hungry for something sweet, and there's some sugar cookies here. You take a bite, and you're like, that wasn't bad. Second bite, it's getting worse. 3rd, 4th bite, you're like, someone needs to finish this cookie for me. I don't want it. And it really has this sort of diminishing desire for it. Now, why do I bring these up? The reason I bring these up is because when we come to a very well-known passage of Scripture, it can be our temptation to think of it like the sugar cookie, where we're like, oh, I've already heard the Good Samaritan before. I don't need to. Like, I can kind of tune out what has to be said here. And my encouragement to you is to think of it more like a durian. And to realize that every time we come back to it, you can more deeply appreciate the complexity of flavor and the nuance and the depth to it, so that you like it more than when you heard it the first time. So that's my encouragement to you. Like I said, today we're going to be talking about the parable of the Good Samaritan. But before we jump into it, let me pray. Heavenly Father, I pray that you would be with and among us today as we study your word, Lord. I pray that you'd help me to be clear, that you'd help me not get in the way of the working of your Spirit, and that you'd be working in the hearts of your people here and blessing them and encouraging them through your word. I ask all these things in your name. Amen. So if you're anything like me, probably when you hear the word Samaritan, the first thing that comes to mind is good. You just think of the Good Samaritan. This is our main touch point for understanding who the Samaritans are in the Bible. And so we have ministries named after this Samaritan and things like that. One thing we miss with this level of familiarity is we miss how the original audience might have heard this parable. They would not have considered, Samaritans to be good. That would not have been a default understanding to the first century Jew who heard this story. And we'll dig into that today. Now our passage revolves around this one question that this Jewish lawyer, it's probably some sort of Jewish legal scholar, asks Jesus. He asks Jesus, who is my neighbor? Who is my neighbor? And that's really going to be at the heart of what we're talking about today. And this is going to be kind of the main point that we'll see. We uphold the commandment to love our neighbor by showing compassion to a friend or enemy in need, because God first showed compassion to us. We uphold the commandment to love our neighbor by showing compassion to a friend or an enemy in need, because God showed compassion to us first. Normally I have 3 points. Today I went a little wild and I have 5 points, but they're shorter than normal. So 5 points today, looking at 5 figures in our text. So first we're going to look at this lawyer, this Jewish legal scholar. Second, we'll look at the priest in the parable and the Levite, but mainly the priest. Third, we'll talk about the Samaritan in the parable. Fourth, we'll kind of step back and look at the beaten man, the man who is robbed and left for dead in the parable. And fifth, we'll close by talking about the ultimate Good Samaritan, Jesus. So let's start by talking about this lawyer, this Jewish legal scholar. So our passage begins not with a parable. It doesn't just jump into it. Our passage begins with this Jewish legal scholar getting up, presumably in a context where there are fellow Pharisees and legal scholars with him, getting up and asking Jesus a question: how can I be saved? Now, at first glance, we might think he's asking for himself, but the passage says he does this to test Jesus. So he asks Jesus this. Jesus, in classic fashion, just turns the question back on him and is like, well, what does the law say? And so the man answers correctly. He says that it says to love the Lord your God and to love your neighbor as yourself. This sort of twofold summary of the law he gives Jesus. And Jesus is like, you're right, you got it. And that could have been where it ended. But the man decides to ask a follow-up. And it says to vindicate himself. Probably he feels kind of lame asking a question and then just doing all the talking himself. So he's like, all right, I got to ask a follow-up here. He asks, and who is my neighbor? And this is a more difficult question. It doesn't have as stock of an answer. So we just read before the parable, we just read Leviticus 19, which is in the Old Testament where it says to love your neighbor as yourself, where this Jewish legal scholar is pointing to when he says that. Generally, the people in Jesus' time probably read this command to love your neighbor as yourself. They read it as applying to fellow Israelites, fellow Jews, as well as sort of friendly visitors in the land. So it's a command to love your fellow Israelite and to be hospitable and to love those who are in kind of your in your house, in your neighborhood, who are visiting or passing through. So generally, probably this Jewish legal scholar was thinking that would be the correct answer. And we actually have some evidence both in the Bible and outside of it to kind of back this up. Outside of the Bible, if you've ever heard of the Dead Sea Scrolls, they found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, these are documents that were written before Jesus even, they found this. It says, "Love the sons of light and hate all of the sons of darkness." Similarly, in one of the intertestamental book, it's called Sirach. In Sirach 12, it says this, "Give to the devout, but do not help the sinner. Do good to the humble, but do not give to the ungodly. Hold back their bread, and do not give it to them." As confirmation for this, actually look at Jesus' words in the Sermon on the Mount, where he says, "You have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy." So probably this lawyer, when he asks, "Who is my neighbor?" is thinking Jesus is going to say, well, of course, it's your fellow Israelite, it's your fellow Jew. And also maybe some of the righteous, God-fearing Gentiles who are in the land, like them as well. But mainly, this applies to your fellow Jew. So this is probably how he is thinking. He's thinking those people are the insiders. Outside of that, they're outsiders. If they're neutral, I don't have to care about them at all. If they're my enemy, I oppose them. I hate them. Now, before we hear Jesus' response to this, it's worth acknowledging that for many of us as Christians, we might know the sort of theological answer to the question of who is my neighbor. Well, of course, it's everyone's my neighbor. But in terms of how we behave, oftentimes our behavior is in line more with this lawyer than with our theological understanding. Many of us, I think, and myself included in this, have the tendency of viewing the people in our own class, in our own circles, in our own cultures, our own religions, our own political parties, as being the insiders, as being the people we're obligated to care about, and the people outside of that as being people we don't need to care about. So before we move on, I would just encourage you to take a moment to consider who might that be for you. Who are the people in your own life who implicitly you might be considering outsiders, who you don't need to be bothered with? So anyway, keep that in mind as we move forward and look at Jesus' response. So let's move to the second point, talking about the priest and the Levite. So Jesus responds to this question not with an answer, but with a story, with a parable. And he launches into this, and he starts talking about this man who's going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he gets attacked by robbers, and they take all his stuff, they strip him, and they leave him nearly dead alongside the road. Now, for context, the road leading from Jerusalem to Jericho is like a 17 or 18-mile road, and particularly in that time, it was sort of like a hilly, kind of barren desert, so there weren't a lot of people there, and so it would be easy for robbers to camp out there and ambush people. I was trying to think of like a good sort of illustration, and good sort of mental picture. The best one that came to mind is from Star Wars: A New Hope. R2-D2 and C-3PO land on Tatooine, and then they wander through the desert, and these Jawas ambush them. If you don't know what that is, that's totally fine. But if that helps, then I'm glad. So basically, it's a dangerous road, easily ambushable, I guess. So robbers would often attack people on that road. So the fact that he's going on his own is a little dangerous. So he gets jumped, and we may miss this. He seems to be pretty much nearly dead. He seems to be out cold, out in the middle of the desert, by himself, unclothed, and seriously wounded. So he is in a situation of dire need. This is life and death. This is not sort of can someone help him get up and kind of stroll with him? He is likely going to die if he's left out in the heat or in the cold for any amount of time. So he's in a dangerous situation. Now, then things start to seem like they're going to start looking up for him, because lo and behold, who is coming down the road that day but a priest? And the Jewish audience at the time would have been like, oh, this is great news. Someone's going to be able to help, and this is going to be an example of how we're supposed to love our neighbor. You help the fallen man in need, is probably the thinking. When we read priest, probably think in our context, pastor or a nun or a humanitarian of some kind who is more likely to help. But the priest walks right on by. He crosses to the other side and goes around him. He leaves him. And we see the exact same thing from the Levite who comes after him. The Levite's just a lesser religious figure in the sort of Jewish religious system. So they both walk by and don't help him. Why is this? Why do they not help him? Well, there's different sort of speculation on why this is. Generally, people think the reason is because in the Old Testament and in Jewish law, there are rules about cleanliness and uncleanliness, and so the thinking is, well, this priest can't stop and become unclean by touching this bloody, beaten man. He might even think he's dead, and so he can't touch a dead body. So he's passing for that reason. And it's possible, but there are a couple factors that point against this. First of all, it says the priest was going down that road. Now, this is this is actually helpful in terms of understanding a lot of the Bible. Whenever you are going to Jerusalem, you are going up to Jerusalem. One does not go down to Jerusalem. You could be on the peak of Mount Everest, and you would say, I went up from the peak of Mount Everest to Jerusalem. It's how it is understood in the Bible. So the fact that it says he was going down means he was leaving Jerusalem. So he's not going towards the temple. He's leaving the temple. Presumably he's already finished his temple service. And so his cleanliness and things like that would be less of a factor. The second thing is there were traditions and laws at this time that basically said if you see a body alongside the road and if he thinks it's a dead body, if you see a dead body along the road and no one is there to bury it, it is your obligation as a priest to take care of that body. The desire to not have one of your brothers, like the body of one of your brothers, lying out to decompose is much greater than it is to uphold certain, avoiding blood, cleanliness, things like that. So if this was a dead body, he is likely obligated to take care of it. So then why does he just walk by? Why doesn't he do something about it? Why doesn't he help the man? Well, I think the answer is actually more obvious. It would be a lot of work to help the man. It would inconvenience him significantly to help this fallen man. And before we come down too harshly on this priest or this Levite, it's worth acknowledging that many of us, again myself included, would probably do the same thing. It's a lot of work to help someone in need. It takes a lot of effort, and so it's so much easier to just walk around. This priest is probably not some nefarious, wicked man who just hates this guy or something like that. He's probably really busy, and he probably has a lot of things, or he's tired, and he's got somewhere to be, and so he can't be bothered. And the good reminder here for us is that oftentimes the opposite of loving your neighbor is not hating your neighbor. It is ignoring your neighbor. The opposite of loving your neighbor can often be ignoring your neighbor, not bothering to help them, not being concerned to care for them. And I think oftentimes that is where we struggle. That's where I definitely struggle. So that is not, however, where our third man down the road struggles. And that brings us to point 3, the Samaritan. Now, this is where things get interesting. Presumably, the Jewish audience listening to Jesus probably thought at this point, oh, this is going to be a story about, the every man helping the person in need. So we had the priest and then we had the Levite, these two religious figures, and they're not helping. And so the next man down the road is going to be the ordinary Jewish man who sees the man in need and goes to him and helps him. And it's going to be this reminder that you need to, every man is called to do this. Well, they're sort of right in that Jesus is sort of speaking negatively of the religious leaders. But then Jesus just chucks a wrench into that whole plan and says, but a Samaritan. And this would have, thrown people into chaos, basically. Now, who were the Samaritans? So what is a Samaritan? It requires a little bit, just briefly, a little bit of Old Testament background. So in the Old Testament, the kingdom of Israel is divided into two empires, the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. The northern kingdom establishes its capital at the city of Samaria, thus being called the Samaritans. That northern kingdom, Samaria, is conquered much earlier than the southern kingdom. And they're conquered by the Assyrians, and the Assyrians are brutal. And their strategy for making sure there's no more uprisings is to move a bunch of people from a different place, a bunch of Gentiles from somewhere else in their empire, into Samaria, and just having them intermarry, diluting the culture, diluting the religion. And so Samaria becomes this sort of they sort of worship God, but not really, like in a sort of twisted, mixed up way. They sort of have kind of a Bible, but it's different with lots of changes from the one that the Jews in the south are using. They have at times attacked the southern empire. They're sort of seen, to use Harry Potter language, they're seen as kind of like mudbloods to the people in the south. So the Jews of Jesus' time looked upon Samaritans very negatively. They were seen as sort of like half-breed, traitors, heretics, villains. Any Jew of the time who heard that a Samaritan was coming down the street would have thought, oh, this man means no good. At best, he'll ignore him. At best, that's what he will do. But then Jesus goes on. He says, but a Samaritan, as he journeyed, came to where he was, and when he saw him, and Jesus saves sort of the heart and soul, the center of the whole parable to the end of the sentence to kind of, it's a little cliffhanger sort of thing. And he goes, he had compassion. The Samaritan had compassion on this fallen Jewish man. Regardless of who he is, he goes to him and he helps him. And then as we read the parable, he goes to significant lengths to help him. So he binds up his wounds, he cares for his wounds. He then proceeds to give him his animal, basically. He puts him on his animal, and he walks instead of riding his own animal so that this guy can ride and be carried. He then takes him to an inn. He stays the night with him. He pays his way. He leaves money for him, and he says, if more money is needed, I'll cover it. So this Samaritan goes to great lengths to care for this fallen Jewish man. And in doing this, as Jesus is telling this Samaritan is really blasting apart this legal scholar's view of who is my neighbor. This Samaritan should view the Jew as his enemy, or at the very least as sort of an undesirable person he doesn't care at all about. But instead, he sees him in need and he helps him. And this is just a great reminder that oftentimes we are called not only to love our neighbor who is our friend, but our neighbor who is our enemy. Earlier I read from Matthew 5 when Jesus was talking about at the Sermon on the Mount. And he says, you have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. And then Jesus says this, but I say to you, love your enemy and pray for those who persecute you. See, this parable is really a word picture, a demonstration of this command of Jesus. But I say to you, love your enemy and do it actively. Actively pursue their well-being. It's not enough just to have sort of positive mental leanings towards something that have no action behind them in this situation. It's a call to be actively pursuing the good and the life of your neighbor. Now, before we dig a little bit more into what it means to be a good neighbor, I want to talk briefly about this beaten man. So let's move to the fourth point, which is the defeated man. Now, presumably this man is Jewish. He's going between two Jewish cities. Sorry for doing that. He's going between two Jewish cities. Jesus is talking to a Jewish audience. The man is implicitly Jewish. Why does Jesus tell the parable this way? Why does he tell it from the perspective of this broken, beaten Jewish man? For example, he could have told the parable differently. He could have told it like this. He could have said, There was a Samaritan man going between two Samaritan cities, and he was attacked by robbers and left for dead. Then a Samaritan priest and a Samaritan religious man wander by him, see him in need, and don't help him. But then a noble Jew walks past him, sees him in his time of need, and decides, I will help this man. Wouldn't that have kind of landed better with his Jewish audience, to have the sort of the hero of the story be a fellow Jew, so that they could be like, that's what I want to be like. That's a hero. I'm going to do that. Why does Jesus tell it in this sort of flipped way where the Jew is the victim, the one alongside the road who can't care for himself? Why bother telling it this way? Well, there's probably more than two reasons for this, but I only thought of two, so I'll give you those. The first is that Jesus' point is not to impress upon his audience sort of the like nobility and magnanimity and virtue of the Jewish people. He's not seeking to impress them in that way. Instead, I think he's trying to make them think of it from the point of view of a victim. So when you're a victim, you are much more inclined, when you're in this situation of great need, you're much more inclined to view someone else as your neighbor. Like when you are doing well, of course you don't need this Samaritan man to help you, but when you are in need, you do. And so Jesus is forcing this perspective on them to make them think about it from that perspective. I think that's one reason. The second reason, though, I think maybe even deeper than that. I think Jesus is giving this perspective because he's communicating that the parable is about more than just you need to go and love your neighbor. I think he is communicating something deeper. He's making the point that we ourselves, the listeners of this parable, are like this man beaten alongside the road. I think it's a picture of our relationship with God. See, we are before God like this helpless man alongside the road. Before God, we are defeated and unable to save ourselves. There's nothing that we can do to save ourselves. We have made God our enemy through our repeated sinfulness, our repeated rebellion against him and rejection of him. And therefore, we are vulnerable and helpless before God. And therefore, we need someone to come and show us mercy in order for us to be saved. At the end of the parable, Jesus asks the lawyer which of the three men who walked by was his neighbor. And the lawyer responds, the one who showed him mercy. We, as people, need someone to show us mercy. And that brings us to the last point, point 5, the true Good Samaritan, Jesus. Jesus is the ultimate Good Samaritan. Jesus is the eternal Son of God, and he sees us broken and utterly incapable of saving ourselves. There's nothing that we can do that will make us righteous, that will make us good before God. Nothing we can do to save ourselves. Jesus sees us in this state, and he has compassion on us. And it is not something in us that made us desirable to Jesus. It's not that Jesus saw some great traits in us and decided to save us. Titus 3 tells us that God saved us not because of works done by us in righteousness, but according to his own mercy. So Jesus sees us in our need, according to his own mercy, decides to come and save us. He comes down in the form of a man to save us. But whereas the Samaritan is, inconvenienced, he certainly has to give a lot of time and energy. Jesus gives infinitely more. He comes down as a man and gives his life to save us. He gives the far greater thing to his enemy to save us. He comes down, dies on the cross, gives his life, takes the judgment of God on himself so that we can be forgiven. And so the Bible talks about how by his wounds we are healed. We are like that broken man. By Jesus' fatal wounds, our wounds are healed. Our wounds are recovered. And so when we put our faith in Jesus, Jesus takes our place. So what does Jesus mean then when he says, go and do likewise? What does this mean for us? How do we apply it to our own lives? One temptation I think we could have is to hear this parable. Jesus says it. The guy asks him at the beginning, how can I be saved? Jesus says to, love your neighbor. Is the one temptation I think we can have is to think that this is a command that if we do enough good stuff, if we love our neighbor well, perhaps then God will condescend to save us. And that is not what is going on, I think, in this parable at all. You do not have to be an astronomer to understand the relationship between the sun and the moon. If you're a 3-year-old, you can be forgiven for looking up at the sun and going, that is a bright thing and it's emitting a lot of light, and then looking up at the moon and going, that is a thing that is also emitting a lot of light, but just less. But once you've taken third grade science, or maybe it's even earlier than that, I don't remember. Once you've taken early science, you know that the moon actually doesn't make any light. It is not emitting any light. If there was no sun, it would be a dead space rock that did nothing, with no heat, no light whatsoever. The reason I say this is because we, as Christians, are not like the sun. We are not like little suns. We are like the moon. We reflect the righteousness of Christ. We do not emit righteousness ourselves that makes God desire us, that makes God want to save us. Rather, Christ shines on us first, and then we shine on others because we are reflecting the light of Christ. And so I want us to realize that when it comes to loving our neighbor, we do not love our neighbor first and then God rewards us for it. We love our neighbor because we are reflecting the great love that God first showed us in loving us, his enemy, in need. Now, in terms of how this plays out, I think we can be tempted to think, okay, I'm supposed to love my neighbor, or I'm supposed to love my enemy. But this presentation that Jesus has made is a little simplistic, just suddenly everything is hunky-dory between the Samaritans and the Jews. I don't think Jesus is trying to imply that has smoothed out all issues, all differences between these two people groups. Rather, Jesus is emphasizing that when you see someone in need, whether it be your friend or your enemy, you are called to help them. One example that came to mind for me is something I heard a while ago, and I went and looked it up. Back in 2011, it was during the Arab Spring. There was this violent uprising in Egypt, and there was a lot of unrest between religious groups there, particularly between the Muslims there and the Coptic Christians. And at one point, there was a serious threat on a group of Muslims who were worshiping. And the Coptic Christians went and gathered around the worshiping Muslims and formed a human wall around them to protect them as they're worshiping. After that, the Muslims did the same for Christian churches, gathering around and protecting them at points. And the idea is that these are people who are seeing someone who maybe even they would consider an enemy, that definitely someone very different from themselves, but they see them in need and they rise to the occasion to help them and to protect them. It's not some sort of it's not some sort of utopic vision, John Lennon, imagine everyone, no religions, everything is smoothed out. It's nothing like that. There's still definitely clear, strong differences between them. But it is seeing someone in need, perhaps even an enemy in need, and saying, because Jesus saved me, because Jesus loved me as his enemy, I will therefore choose to protect you, to care for you, to love you in your time of need. One final example I want to mention is I'm not much of a sports guy, but back in 2013, there's an NBA player named Brian Scalabrine. He's famous for this one quote. He was playing against a bunch of pickup basketball players who were trash-talking to him. And he famously said, I am closer to LeBron than you are to me. Basically, he says, the skill gap between me and LeBron, widely considered the best player of that era, and this era maybe, I don't know. Not getting into that. But he's saying he's closer to LeBron in terms of his skill than these street players are to him. The reason I mention this is because when we think of the worst sinner on earth, the most wicked person on earth, we need to realize that you and I are closer to them than we are to the perfect righteousness of Christ. And because of that, we cannot view our neighbor, or even our enemy, as too great a void to cross, because Jesus crossed an infinitely greater void to come and save us. So therefore, when we say, oh, this person is just too wicked for me to love, what we're saying is, Jesus, it was easier for you to love me than it is for me to love them. And my encouragement to you is, that cannot be. Jesus crossed such an enormous void, his perfect righteousness coming down to dwell among us, to save us, to die for us when we were his enemy. He crossed such a significant void that we can do the much less lighter work comparatively. It's not easy work, but compared to the work of Christ, we can do the work of pursuing our neighbor, of loving our neighbor. Let's pray.